Okay, so we're off and running here. It's 10 minutes to 5. We're going to proceed for an hour, so we'll be done here at around 10 minutes to 6. I look forward to this discussion because we have some very interesting people on this panel who have stories to tell, including some that are quite personal in their attempts to conduct journalism in 2019. Starting off on my left, Zaffar Abbas. He is the editor of the Dawn newspaper in Pakistan. It is one of, if not the largest paper in the country. He's got subscription figures that most newspaper people here would absolutely kill for. Next is Ute Brucker. She's the head of the International News Department, German Radio and Television, SWR, ARD. As you may know, Germany has a very big public broadcasting space, and ARD is central to the coverage of that country. She has some interesting thoughts for us to come. Maria Ressa, CEO, Executive Editor of Rappler in the Philippines. This is an online news organization that makes news in the Philippines, not just through the reporting it does, what it does with data, but is also in the news because if CNN is #1 on Donald Trump's hit list, Rappler is #1 on Rodrigo Duterte's hit list in the Philippines. David Jordan, you've already heard from, not only on the IPI board, but also Director of Editorial Policy and Standards, BBC UK. Raj Kamal Cha, Chief Editor, The Indian Express. He arrives here quite exhausted from covering the Indian election campaign, the voting for which, not the campaigning, the voting for which lasted 5 weeks. And there were, and the Indian media space, we did a couple of pieces during the campaign at the Listening Post just because there's nothing quite like it. Maria Ressa, I want to start with you. Before we get into the details of the kinds of issues you're facing and trying to do your job and conduct journalism in the Philippines in 2019, why don't you start off by telling us how easy or difficult it was for you to travel here to join us today?
So I think Barbara knows this, and Milika, I have to ask for permission from at least 5 different courts, and most likely 2 to 3 months in advance. I've had to post bail 8 times, and so in these courts, when you post bail, not only do you pay the bail, you also have to post travel bond, and let me just think. In February, I was arrested twice in a 5-week period and detained once. And the worst part, I paid more in bail and bonds than Imelda Marcos, who's actually been convicted.
Why don't you tell us, Maria, what you have been charged?
I mean, in the end, there's so many ludicrous charges. We were charged 14 times. Sorry, here we go. We were charged 11 times in a 14-month period. And the very first charge was an attempt to take away our business license. We've been fighting that in court. That happened in January 2018. And they all are ludicrous. I mean, this is a very Putin-esque charge. That the first one is that we are controlled by foreigners. We're not. We're fiercely independent. Rappler, we started Rappler from scratch. And every other charge after that was built on that mother case.
That charge that you were controlled by foreigners was based entirely, if I'm not mistaken, on a minority stake in your company held by Pierre Omidyar, who was also the tech billionaire behind, I can't remember where the money came from.
eBay.
Oh yeah, he's eBay, and he also funds The Intercept in the U.S.
Omidyar Network has a 5.5% of the Philippine depository receipts. If you look at like American depository receipts, that's what they have. It is a completely constitutional way to invest in a media company in the Philippines, even though 100% Filipino ownership. Essentially, the Omidyar Network said that we believe in you, and even if we can't own your shares, we want to be part of this. So all they would have recourse to are economic benefits. benefits, which, frankly, we set out a 5-year timeline to break even. We did 1 month before President Duterte was elected. And then, then the exponential attacks happened online. It wasn't just us, but I became a favorite when we came out with a 3-part series on the propaganda war, data-based. And then post that, every single thing that was astroturfed on social media then came about 1.5 years out of President Duterte's mouth. But let's not forget the really ludicrous charges of cyber libel, which as a story we published 7 years ago, which we published before the law that we supposedly violated was even enacted. So I've run out of synonyms.
I want to, eventually, Maria, I want to get to, you're talking about the problems that you've run into with the state and the authorities, but there's also the problems that you've run into with the public online, which is I think, where some of Rappler's most interesting work comes. So we'll get to that eventually. In Pakistan, Zaffar, dealing with the state can be problematic because sometimes you don't even know who you're dealing with. True? Why don't you inform people here some of the issues and some of the shadows who you have to fight as a newspaper editor in today's Pakistan?
Well, Pakistan is one of those unique countries where there is no one center of power. The country, half of its period, it has been ruled by the military directly. And even now, they have a certain say, and they want to have certain say in the matter of governance, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's economic policy, whether it's interior policy. So, and when they get involved in these things and media handles those things, the relationship deteriorates or a new relationship evolves. So there are several power centers, and the 2 major power centers, as I said, is the government, and the other is, of course, military and its related state institutions. Over a period of time, the state institutions have tried to sell their own narrative as the only narrative that matters, whether it's about foreign policy, economic policy, local policies, dealing with armed insurgency, dealing with armed militants, Islamic groups or organizations. And if the media tries to unearth some of the human rights violations, the narrative is that criticizing such actions or exposés, doing exposés means you are doing something anti-state. You are not a patriotic organization. Dawn has suffered badly because of that over a period of time. And even today, there are parts of Pakistan where the newspaper is not allowed to be distributed. The distribution is disrupted. Then there are television channels, independent television channels or privately owned television channels. If one wing of the government doesn't like a certain news story, they will just do one thing. They will call the private companies that distribute news channels through cable networks just to pull the plug, and the channel will go off air. And it constantly happens. If 2 years ago it was with Geo Television, which is one of the biggest television channels, couple of months back it happened to another news channel. It has happened with Dawn. And these have now become tools to force journalists or media organizations to indulge in what we call self-censorship. And editors are not sure how to handle the situation. In many cases, there has been complete capitulation. They have surrendered to the wishes of the state institutions. Wherever newspapers or television channels have tried to resist, the force of the state has come against them, trying to disrupt the distribution, as I call, pulling plug on cable networks. And this fight goes on. Unfortunately, the state institutions are succeeding in a way because they have managed to divide the media, creating interest for groups that support the state policies on such matters. And secondly, using the social media tools, weaponizing them to attack independent-minded journalists, branding them as anti-state and unpatriotic. And such attacks are so vicious that you cannot imagine. As Maria was pointing out, this is exactly, in a way, is happening with Dawn, some other independent newspapers or TV channels, and it is an ongoing thing. And the only demand, without saying it in so many words, is you surrender to the wishes of these state institutions and everything will be all right.
I did choose my words carefully when I said that Zaffar, Abbas, and his organization are fighting shadows, because what was so instructive about what happened in Pakistan in 2018 is that GOTV, which is one of the major 24-hour news channels there and has changed the political landscape along with the other news channels that came along at the behest of Musharraf back in the day in the early 2000s. GOTV disappeared in various parts of Pakistan. Certain cable carriers, it was gone. 1 second you're watching the channel, then it goes to black. You can't see it in Lahore, but you can see it in Islamabad. It's available in Karachi, but not in Peshawar. Journalists do what they normally do. They get on the phone to the government. They say, what's going on? And the government flat out says, we don't know. We don't know. And all of you have read along the line, along the way, that in Pakistan, there is the existence of the deep state, whether it's ISI, the intelligence service, whether it's the military not wanting to let go of the power that it's officially surrendered. And often democracy is undermined in Pakistan, but seldom has it ever been so glaring, where you had a signal 1 second and it was gone the next, and the government couldn't even explain how that happened. I want to go to Raj to talk to us. He's still in election recovery mode. But when Zaffar was talking about pressure coming from the public, from the social media space, and I can remember back in the day, Raj, when social media was invented, everyone said, oh, this is going to be a counterbalance to the state powers and the big actors and the corporate actors, and we all drank that Kool-Aid for about 20 minutes. And now we are seeing these forces aligned. And I just offer that as a starting point. Take this where you want to. And just for the other panelists, please don't wait for me. If you want to jump in on one another, do that, please. Just hit your mic button.
With Zaffar, is it okay? Can you hear me? Yeah. With Zaffar and Maria on stage, it is fun because you get to shine in reflected glory. It also helps you to turn the light inwards, which I shall do. And the first thing I want to do is to look at the subject of this evening, which says, how can we build a partnership with the readers or with the audience to defend an independent media? And what I want to do is to put a seed of doubt about that relationship. And some of the seeds I found when I was on the road about a fortnight ago. It was Samuel Johnson who said that nothing concentrates the mind more sharply than the prospect of you being hanged. Well, for a reporter, what sharpens the mind is when you look at people, young and old, and you listen to them very passionately defend their political choices. And what I found, that the relationship between the media and the public is a lot more complex than what we think it is. One, there is a tacit assumption that there is a sense of solidarity, and that we are both on the same side defending something. That may not be the case. And what I found was that in some, there were times when the line between us was very hard, and at some times the line between us did not even exist. I'll just zoom out for a bit and tell you a few basic facts about India, which will help frame this conversation. We have about 750 to 800 million people under the age of 35. We have 400 million people who actively use the internet. That's the second largest in the world. Data is the cheapest in India, about 26 cents for a GB, when it's about $14 or $15 in the US. It is about $18 to $19 here. What this means is that you have several people with the phone in their hand. And when I went to them and asked them, what's your source of news? Almost everyone looked at their phones and said, you know what, we get stuff forwarded to us. I have watched this on TV. I have watched a bit of this interview. I have read a paragraph of this story. And when you hear that, then you seriously think that they may not be getting the source of news from people on the stage. Number one. Number two, I was at a World Editors Conference a couple of years ago. Every booth in the convention hall was selling a software which told the newsroom what readers were reading in real time, so that every newsroom could respond to it. So there you have it, the role of the public as the news editor. We saw a documentary in this room a couple of hours ago called A Dark Place, where you see a section of the people who watch the news behave in ways that are very scary, that stifle free speech. The point I make is that we need to look at the relationship between what we call our readers or what we call our audience and the newsroom, and unless we get a sense of that, it will be difficult for us to define our role going forward. It is very, very easy. It's very fashionable to say that we work for the people. I have gone to seminars where the morning session is on the dangers of a populist government, and the next session is on how do you maximize your viewership by the same people on stage. And I think that is the fundamental contradiction that stares us in our face. How do we react to it depends on where we are, as Zaffar has his own story. Maria has hers, I have mine, David has his, and Ute has hers. So these are different frameworks, but I think the fundamental thing of how do we protect what is the most fundamental sacred compact of a democracy, which is free speech, which is giving voice to those who don't speak. How do we do that at a time when we are looking at how do we remain economically viable?
Just one more anecdote on the South Asian media scene. It is increasingly common now in South Asia, and we saw this particularly in the Sri Lankan story, that people who have phones, those phones can't phone anybody. They're just data devices. They don't even have a phone capability. So in Sri Lanka, after the attacks, when the government reflexively shut down WhatsApp and other platforms, Sri Lankans could not communicate with each other with this device, because without the online platforms, which had been taken down by the government, so they could no longer get in touch with their family to see if they were okay, because that's where the information is going. The cell phones that were dropped on us 20 years ago, that's what's become of them in South Asia, and I think more and more markets are going to go that way. And what that does is people think that empowers them, it gives them more access to various platforms, and that's true until the authorities decide it's not a good idea. Ute Brucker from the German media space and ARD, one gets the feeling that the German media is sort of coming out of another mini dark period, that we had that populist movement, AfD, is it? AfD? And the revival of this term Lügenpresse, which some of you people may have heard, and it means lying press. And German media, not just publicly funded broadcasters like ARD, but all kinds were under attack. And basically, Lügenpresse was the German term for what Donald Trump calls fake news, right? So how has that battle gone, and why do things look a little better than they did even in 2014, 2015 for the German media?
The why is a bit more difficult. It has gone down a little bit. We have been facing, as you said, the past 3-4 years, the attacks, and Lügenpresse, how you pronounce it in German, is a term that was really very much liked by Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis. So it sounds strange to us. But I think we're not completely over it. It's still there, but it kind of slowed down. Maybe because things slow down from time to time. Maybe because I think the public broadcasters, I can speak for them, were active and took some initiatives. We went out to meet public. We are going more into public debates. For example, our chief editor of the main news show, Tagesschau, met with people in a live event on Google Live, Facebook Live, etc., for an open discussion. Let's say, you can ask me anything you want, and let's discuss about what are fake news and what are your problems with us. So there was a public discussion, but is that the reason why? I don't know. And I'd like to join Raj with this, his skepticism about alliances. I think what is most important is still quality, and this sounds trivial, but when we see that in Austria there is big solidarity movement of the public with anchorman Armin Wolf, for example, from public broadcaster ORF, who has been attacked by the far right-wing party FPÖ, and they wanted to remove him, and they were already starting to do a reform or suggest a reform for public broadcaster in Austria. Why is that? Why are people solidary with him? Because he's one of the best interviewers in Europe, because he's a tough interviewer, but his interviews are based on facts and on really intense investigation, and that's very important, I think, to maintain this, even if it sounds, yeah, we always say that, but I think it's more important now than ever.
And it was a good story to hear, a good anecdote to hear. But there's another anchor guy whose name escapes me, from Poland, was in the state-funded broadcaster. They made him a target under this government, and no one was able to save him. Let's hope there are more Austrias in the future, and fewer Polish anchors,
yeah, I mean,
going down.
It needed that. You've all heard of that fake story. I mean, the famous Ibiza videos.
I think you need to walk our audience through that. Just walk, First of all,
yeah,
what were you doing in Ibiza?
I mean, I'm not Austrian, so I hope my Austrian colleagues here will agree with my short resume. It was on May 17th. German newspapers, Spiegel and Süddeutsche Zeitung, published the news about a secret video of that has been produced almost 2 years ago. Two top party guys of FPÖ, far right-wing Austrian party, were caught up in Ibiza in a villa, talking to a fake Russian niece of an oligarch, billionaire, and suggesting her to buy Austrian daily newspaper, Kronenzeitung, very famous, and a lot of other things. So when this came out, there was really a big movement, and we all know that Austrian government and the vice chancellor had to step down. That was the story. So it maybe needed that video to strengthen the solidarity with public broadcaster.
David, you're with the BBC. I've lived in the UK for 25 years, and I'm trying to think of another country where as much of the political discourse centers on a single news organization as the BBC. You guys get plenty of scrutiny. You deserve some of it. And how do you see this idea, because I know there's some skepticism in the panel, of whether broadcasters can actually ally with the public?
Well, I think for an organization that's funded by the public, it doesn't really have much option, to be honest. The BBC, like many public service broadcasters in Europe and across the world, is funded from what we call a license fee. We're not funded from direct taxation. We're funded in a way which tries to distance ourselves to some extent from the political process. Can't distance ourselves completely from the political process, but it tries to distance ourselves to some extent. And therefore the public almost literally own us. And as a consequence of that, the listening, viewing, reading public online have huge and high expectations of what their public service broadcaster will deliver. They're high at the BBC. I'm sure that's true of every public service broadcaster in Europe and around the world. So we don't have an option, in a way, but to deliver what you describe. I think the circumstances in which we try to deliver that have become very, very much more difficult than they were hitherto. I mean, like Raj, I'm in awe of Maria and of Zaffar and their bravery and courage confronting circumstances which, doesn't happen to the BBC. We do have our troubles from time to time, but they don't consist of being charged with things and being slapped in jail or being taken off the air or any of that sort of stuff. We do get attacked by politicians from time to time. Occasionally we even get attacked by governments, usually at times of war, but we don't have anybody seriously suggesting that people should be slapped in iron as a consequence or taken to the Tower of London, metaphorically speaking. What we do have at the moment in the UK is an extraordinary divisive political issue which literally divides the country in half in terms of its opinions about the whole debate over leaving the European Union, so-called Brexit. And what's been observable about that debate is the extent to which the public and the electorate start aping the behaviour of politicians and activists in their attitude to media. What I mean by that is this. I mean, I have a great deal of respect for politicians, but in my experience, and I was the editor of the BBC's flagship political programme for many years, in my experience, most politicians define impartiality as agreeing with them. If you agree with them, you're impartial. If you don't, you're biased. And what we've observed over time in the UK is that increasing numbers of the electorate are starting to align with that view over this particularly divisive and corrosive political issue, namely the ins and outs of the European Union. And that has engendered an atmosphere that has become extremely sour, and it has also led to this sort of outbursts on social media that are commonplace about other issues in other countries. And it's also led, as was evident in the documentary that you were speaking about, Raj, earlier today, which I unfortunately haven't seen yet, to some fairly vicious social media attacks on our journalists, in particular on our women journalists, and on our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, who you will know, Richard, in the UK. So the situation is a lot more fractious in the UK than it's been for many years, as long as I can remember in politics. That fractiousness has expressed itself in the general population, and there are greater attacks on the BBC and other public service media in particular, but it can't be compared to the Philippines or to Pakistan or to other countries where the threats are physical and real.
Go ahead, Uta.
Don't you think, David, that situation is improving? That's what we see in Germany. And you mentioned it at your speech at the very beginning, that trust is growing in public media and big media outlets?
There's historically been quite a low level of trust in journalism in the UK, but that's for all journalism. There's a higher level of trust for broadcast media than there is for print media, and that's quite rational, actually, given what print media is trying to do and what broadcast media is trying to do. In the UK, print media is aligned, as it is in most countries, and it tends to be aligned in one particular direction. Broadcast media is regulated and is supposed to be impartial. So we're talking about an improvement from a low base. But what the Edelman survey and other surveys have shown is that after, for a long time, social media being relied upon and thought to be a reliable source of information for many people, the scales have fallen from the eyes of many social media users in the UK and elsewhere in the world, faced with the kind of crises there have been in Facebook and other places. And people now don't trust that media to the extent that they did, and increasingly they're looking back to other sources of information and checking back. And what they do in the UK, to a large extent, still, is to say, well, I'm not sure that's true until I've sort of read it on the BBC or seen it on the BBC or seen it on a more reliable news source. So, yes, there is that level of improvement, but that's from a very low base. But at the same time, you've got this big debate which continues about whether or not the UK should be part of the EU, following the referendum that decided that we should pull out. You've got this big debate continuing, becoming ever more rancorous, and that is undermining the trust of some in established institutions that provide news.
I want to pick up on that in just a moment, but we'll be ready to take some questions from the audience in a few minutes' time, so if you have one, just a show of hands, that would be helpful. I think, Raj, and I'd like to hear from Zaffar as well on this, one of the questions that you ask, Raj, is, in this day and age, what does public even mean anymore? So let's dig into that for a minute.
Yeah, it is, to just respond to Ute, I do believe there is a fundamental need for a partnership with those who read us, with those who view us, with those who listen to us. But when I said that it is very hard to define, because the philosophical idea of a public sphere where people of all kinds can come and contest falsehood and truth no longer exists. There are so many silos everywhere, more so in India and in South Asia, where, as I said, most of us citizens are very young. Most of them do not finish school. I'll just give you a statistic. Because we have a right to education, almost 100% of 5-year-olds are starting school. But almost half of them do not finish it. And what that means is that you don't have a system where, I think it is very, very important. I think it is the same importance as free speech, the right of a school kid to get an education where she or he knows how to distinguish what is falsehood. And I think, we talk in our newsrooms that to get the readers of tomorrow, you have to go to school. And I think for some reason, and which I think is good, because I am the father of a kid as well, school teachers haven't lost down in any poll you take on faith. Journalists have fallen down the list, but in most of the countries across the world, school teachers still are very respected. So maybe the time has come for us in the newsroom to look at alliances with school teachers, with scientists, with investigators, with whistleblowers, with truth seekers. I think that would help us a lot more than this very undifferentiated mass we call the public. because many in the public as well don't know how to navigate this space.
Well, Jaha is spot on the issue of illiteracy or lack of education to an extent that, just to give you an example, that in the controversy about media and its role that is going on in Pakistan at the moment, more than 99% of the attacks that come on independent journalists or newspapers like Dawn are from people who do not even read the newspaper. But with these social media attacks, these messages are forwarded, and an atmosphere is created where these journalists are branded as anti-state, unpatriotic, or newspaper being anti-state. The problem over here is that in the past, we could have lived with it. In fact, we used to take the pride in the fact when the government used to criticize the newspaper that we must be doing something right. But now the problem is when this atmosphere is being created, where the public is being made to believe that this is what the newspaper or this journalist is doing is, it is making my colleagues highly vulnerable. Every day I live with the fear that one of the journalists who's walking on the street and introduces himself or herself as member of the Dawn staff can be attacked by the people saying that, oh, you people are anti-Pakistan. But the problem is that what to do with the whole thing. Should I change myself? Now, people like Maria and I go a long way. There was a time for many years she used to work for the CNN, I was working for the BBC, and we used to cover similar same stories for many, many years. Then she moved on to create this amazing news organization. I became the editor of Dawn. But this is what we have done all our professional lives. This is my 39th year in this profession. Should I give up on the values that brought me into this profession and made me do the kind of work that I take pride in? No, I cannot do that. We may lose the battle, we may lose the war, I don't know. So unless some new strategy is evolved by all of us to counter these vicious attacks that are being created by the non-state actors, the state actors, the intelligence services, and international organizations that may be behind these things. These are serious global issues. Yes, they may destroy Dawn tomorrow. A new newspaper may emerge, or new television channel may emerge. But this fight has to go on till such time we evolve a strategy and try to win it.
Can I completely agree, and Zaffar, I mean, we've been talking about this for a while. Can I pull all of our countries together? Because in Pakistan, in Germany, in Britain, in India, in the Philippines, information operations are happening to our public. And I think that this is a time like no other. And we don't really have the right words for it yet, because our gatekeeping powers as journalists have been taken away. And the gatekeepers are technology, social media platforms, technology platforms, who have taken the distribution of news but not the responsibility for it. And it's gamed in a way that allows exponential lies to become facts. So if you look at us, I mean, Time said this, we are the guardians of truth. And no, you should not give up those values. But I think we will move through this. I think this is a very, very difficult time. And like Zaffar, I think we must do this together, because starting in the Philippines, we're trying to get all of the news groups to collaborate together. It is not the normal practice. But the only way you will beat social media algorithms is if we, the guardians of fact, actually work together to spread the facts. Because in the Philippines, the center of the information ecosystem, because 97% of Filipinos are on the internet, 97 of those on the internet are on Facebook. So Facebook is really our internet. We've never had a time in all the world where all of our countries, if you put WhatsApp and Facebook together, that's 2.7 billion accounts. So a lie told in India spreads to Manila, spreads, well, we know what happens sometimes with WhatsApp, right? And it's violent. So without facts, you have no truth. Without truth, you have no trust. How can you talk about a public space? We need to continue doing our jobs. Women are attacked 3 to 10 times more than men, and we know that online violence leads to real-world violence. So the only thing we can do is take our standards and ethics and demand that the technology work with us, do digital forensics, investigative journalism. Anyway, I'm sorry, I will shut up, but I think there is a way out of this, and we have to stay true to our values.
Yeah, but one thing, Maria, you're saying that Zaffar should come back with the facts and stick to the facts, and that's what journalism does. You defend your journalism, with more information. But what Zaffar is telling us is his people are under attack by people who haven't even consumed their media. And they've just been told about it.
Don't even think that they're people. Sorry, not to say, right, because the networks of disinformation, the ones that are trying to tear down democracy, and this began as early as November 2017, when Freedom House said that in 27 countries around the world, cheap armies on social media are tearing down democracies. A year later, in 2018, that number doubled, according to the Oxford Computational Propaganda Research Project. We cannot solve a thinking fast problem, meaning the manipulation of anger and hate against specific targets, with a thinking slow solution, rational journalism. So in my case, and I've really thought about how do we solve this, even if we put out the best journalism, if our public has been taught not to think but to feel and to spread crap and polarize to the point that they don't even get the same feeds, right? No one sees all the attacks against me except me, right? So
Yeah.
how do we do it? We must make sure we know the technology. We must make sure that the tech people actually understand what we do and the responsibilities they need to have. I'm told, that's not our job, but it is our job. That's the only way we'll survive. You have to stop the poison. You have to stop drinking the poison so that you can at least stabilize the body politic and then let the facts come in.
Yeah. Maria, you are absolutely right. That is the way to tackle it. You talked about the unity and how it can help to the greater cause. Unfortunately, that is becoming increasingly difficult in countries like Pakistan. There was a time when we were really struggling for press freedom in the country. On one call of the Federal Union in Pakistan in 1978, every newspaper shut down, went on strike in protest against the government restrictions on one newspaper. Now the situation is the proliferation of television channels and newspapers has gone to the advantage of these state institutions and state actors. Why? Because in developing countries, the size of the economic cake is very small. And when we are dealing with something like 70 news channels, 300 newspapers, where is that advertising going to come from? And so what is happening is the state institutions is using the situation to their advantage. You side with us, you will be the good guy, and we will make sure you get bulk of the advertising. You shut down a television channel for 1 week, the advertising moves to another television channel. You shut down a newspaper, distribution of a newspaper in large parts of the country, the advertising will move to other newspapers. In the past, it was not the case. Now it is being used by the state institutions to their advantage, and it is working. Yes, of course, we will try to bring journalists together to unite. But unless the publishers and the owners of these media houses realize that today it's happening with us, tomorrow it can happen with them. The government can change, the policies can change, so they need to be made to realize that this situation can go against them if they do not unite. If we manage to unite them, then there is a scope to even talk about these bots and other things that are being used to attack and malign journalists and journalism in the country. I keep repeating one thing, that in the past there was a trend to knock down a journalist, kill a journalist in Pakistan if he or she was working against a militant organization's policies or the government policies, or going against the intelligence agencies, working on an expose. That trend to a certain extent has slowed down and there are various reasons for that which can be discussed. But now what they're trying to do is that probably killing journalists is a bad idea. Why not kill journalism? Just destroy journalism. Create a situation where no one has any faith in good journalism, and you will win the war. And this is exactly what the state institutions are doing at the moment.
It's very Russian, right?
Can I jump in? Yeah, and the scary thing is that it is not just the ruling establishment. Those in the political opposition as well have no respect for free speech. And I think the bigger issue, and maybe we will talk about it in the next few days, is just as liberal politics has not been able to deal with nationalism and patriotism in a manner that is inclusivist and respectful of diversity, we have reached a stage where free speech, where there are very, very few people who will stand up for free speech. And that's why it's very, very important that we have a session like this, because most of us now can self-publish. The fact that we can put a picture and a Facebook post, and the fact that we can forward something on our phones has given us the false feeling of freedom of speech. And that is what, I think that is one reason we do not stand up and scream or shout when free speech is under attack.
On that point of killing journalism instead of killing journalists, isn't one of the ways to do that like what Maria Ressa has gone through in the Philippines? I mean, she has online received death threats, rape threats. Correct me if I'm wrong, Maria, but one of those bloggers, was it Pinoy, posts a picture of her house, her home address, in office. That's a way to kill journalism, isn't it? Because when the part that's really scary, every once in a while I speak to university kids, and I spoke to two groups of American students. I'm from Canada, but I spoke to two groups of American students a couple of weeks ago, and both of them were attending journalism schools and with comms schools attached, PR and communication schools attached. And I see this with every university group I speak to. Those journalism schools are shrinking. Those communications and PR schools are growing. I know there are a lot of people in the comms world who actually do good work, but I also know there are a bunch of them who will lie for a living if necessary. And they won't do it for ideological reasons. Like most media organizations that go off, they do it for commercial reasons. They can get paid, they can get paid 80 grand a year working for a pharmaceutical company and 30 grand a year working for an NGO. That's what's going to happen. So one of the places, and I don't know whether you people have any thoughts on the educational side of this, because media is education, because I know my education didn't end when I left school. It's really when it began. This pattern of journalism schools shrinking and communication schools growing, this notion that more people, we're churning out more people now who will lie for a living if necessary, and we're going to have fewer than we've ever had before seeking out the truth. I don't see a good outcome coming out of that.
So I'm optimistic, strangely enough, right? Because you cannot...
Maria Ressa, I just have to say, Maria Ressa, when you put your hand up, like I'm the teacher, it's like you school the rest of us on everything. So keep your hand down and just talk.
So I'm optimistic. I just gave the commencement speech at Columbia University's graduating class of 2019. They are 2/3 women. And they were entering our field knowing why they were doing it. I look at Rappler, and I think the Dawn has been under more sustained attack in a strange way. But I look at Rappler, and, this pressure that we're under has forced us to be stronger. We don't have the normal frictions of an average newsroom. I mean, I actually have to tell our team, and you're watching, I have to tell them to sleep, because we know what we do matters right now, right? So I think that's one. But beyond the education, I think there are two other things we need to think about, and we haven't, as journalists, really embraced this, the fact that our world has fundamentally changed. There's a great book I'm going through that is horrific. It's on surveillance capitalism. By Shoshana Zuboff. We had testified in this 14-nation MP hearing last week, and, you know, I hadn't thought about it that way. Our actions, our free will, we're just talking about free press, but essentially her thesis is that our future actions have already been sold, and that the data on us is actually meant to manipulate us. So whether it is for political gains, power, or for commercial gains, that someone has bought that ability to come in at just the right moment to sell us water, like, right? So that's not, and then the other book I would recommend is Timothy Snyder wrote a book called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. It's also scary because we're living through it right now. It just puts all of the tech tools have been used by authoritarian-style leaders. And I'll end with just this one last thing, which is Bolsonaro. When you listen to Bolsonaro in Brazil, and all the news groups there are starting to really be scared, like we all are. When you listen to him, I could have been listening to Duterte or Trump or Modi. The words are the same, the attacks are the same. When Trump called the New York Times and CNN fake news, a week later, Duterte called Rappler fake news. There is a playbook, right? And whether that's spread by digital agencies for money or Russia. I mean, the disinformation networks are connected.
You see, Richard, we do discuss and we try to create this depressing scenario, but at the same time, whenever I am at a conference or seminar, I'm listening to somebody like Maria or a colleague who's in Turkey and not being allowed to leave the country. I mean, it gives us hope that it's not just you or your newspaper or your organization which is coming under attack. This is something happening in many, many countries, and that is where it becomes not just a collective fight, but it doesn't create a depressing situation that, oh my God, the world has shut its eyes towards us. So that they do give us hope in many ways.
I think we have a question from the floor, but before we go to that, Maria, I take note of what you said, and I've seen it as well in those graduating classes, the 66% factor, female factor, and part of me loves that and to see that, but part of me also wonders, is that because the glass ceiling here is being lowered? Is that because the economic model behind media it has been disintegrated by digital? No one's come up with a solution, and fewer and fewer males who are interested in making a living, supporting a family, are going into the field. I kind of fear that. I don't mind telling you. Was there a question over here from this gentleman? Speak up, please. Sorry.
Half an hour ago, when you said in 2 minutes I'm going to open the floor, I had one question. Now I have 2.5, but very short, very short, very short. The first one, some months back, there was a television day in this very building. Indeed, probably all over the world, but in this very building there was a big ceremony. I went there, and indeed it was not television day, it was EBU day. So my question is, there were none of these many new channels. For you two, television day and EBU day should be synonyms? That's my first question. The second question, yesterday there was a workshop next door in an institute called Geneva Academy. It's a law institute on human rights. And there was a session on what you call civil society space. And then came the question, are the media part of civil society? And the spokesperson for Civicus, which is a large coalition of civil society organizations, said, most media, yes, but not public media. And I asked, is BBC public media in your sense? Yes. So can you understand why some significant segment of civil society does not consider public media civil society? And my last question, when Maria Ressa say we are the warden, the guardians of truth, I am not sure I quote who is we.
Well, I don't know who wants to go on that. David, public media. Now I understand that there's also a distinction in the way certain people describe media being state-owned or publicly supported, whether there are license fees or whether the money's coming in. I get that there's that distinction, but why don't you have at that? And I get the feeling that Uta wants in as well.
Is the BBC part of civic society? Is it part of public media? Yeah, absolutely. And so are all our other colleagues in public service media around the world. In fact, I would say in most parts of the world they're a crucial part of the civic discourse that takes place. And that's not just because, well, it is crucially because you will find that most public service media has codes of ethics which are committed to impartial, objective, independent news, factually accurate news, and they're held to those standards. So they can't take sides in the way that many newspapers do and can. They are required to reflect all viewpoints, which is what we're required to do in the BBC. They're required to give a broad sense of the views that happen in the civic space and to report them all, not to limit them to one viewpoint or another viewpoint. So my view would be that they're a crucial part. They play a crucial role in the civic debate and in civic society, and that's part of the reason why retaining public service media is so important in the world, because I wonder where in some of these countries where the determined efforts are being made to undermine trust in media and undermine trust in all sorts of media, I wonder where the public's going to get messages from in the future that they actually believe. Because we know that the public doesn't, broadly speaking, believe politicians. So when politicians speak in the future, when it's reported what they've said, what is going to be believed, and which organisation is going to have the credibility to say things that the public believes. Now, at the moment, that role of what I would call social glue is fulfilled in many countries by public service media, by public media. And in my view, politicians should be very wary of undermining trust in those institutions, because very soon there won't be anybody that the public believes. And when they cry fire, nobody will get the hose pipes, because nobody will believe there is a fire that needs to be combated. So I think it's a very, very crucial role that serious politicians do understand and do wish to preserve. But unfortunately, we are subject to the kinds of pressures which have been described elsewhere at the same time, which could seriously undermine that role in the future.
Not much to add. Just an impression of a conference I've just attended some weeks ago. German intelligence bodies, Secret Service, saying and asking the press to defend freedom of speech and to do fact-checking. They attribute to us the role of fact-checkers, and they say now to us, you are so important. This is strange, huh?
Is that what the intelligence people do in Pakistan?
So we're living on different planets.
Yeah, a similar involvement. We've got about 3 minutes left. There's two questions here. I want to hear both.
Maria, you're supposed to say, who are we?
We are the guardians of the facts, the journalists. I think the journalists who have standards and ethics, who maintain the values of the reason why we became journalists in the first place. Because without the facts, you don't have anything. Without the facts, we can't have a democracy, right? And you cripple the democracy. I think this is a different way of saying what Zaffar just said, which is you kill journalism. Without the facts, you segment everybody so that the voice with the loudest megaphone wins. It is classic Russian. Sorry.
Russian collusion. You heard that from Maria Ressa. So I want to hear these two questions at the same time, and we'll see what we pick up on here. Starting with this gentleman.
Sure, Richard. Thank you for this very deep discussion about the future of the press. Working together, or to get stronger together, the title of this session is very important, actually, from my opinion. we are saluting, of course, the courage of journalists, but I feel that we are mentioning chief editors, the journalists working with international media, but we forget actually many local journalists who are behind bars right now. For example, my colleague Mahmoud Hussein, we know of course that Mahmoud Hussein from Al Jazeera is behind bars. But in Egypt, there is another 27 journalists, local journalists behind bars also, but nobody know about their condition, how many years they are behind bars. So we should work together. We will be stronger together, of course. From my opinion, the local media is
We've got 2 minutes to go here, so we're going to need a question, please.
Not just for the international organizations like BBC, like Al Jazeera. The other question is our enemy actually not only the dictatorship in our country or in our world, but some of our colleagues actually, there is a media war, we can say. I'm talking about my experience in my home country of Egypt. I was Al Jazeera bureau chief in Egypt during the revolution and the coup. My colleague Mahmoud Hussein, the correspondent of Al Jazeera, just to inform you, he is still behind bars, although there is 2 court orders to release him, and we heard now that they are preparing another legal case against him, also to stay more and more behind bars. This is not the crime of the ruler or the government only, but a crime of some of our other colleagues in Egypt. Other media, Egyptian media organizations is attacking us, is describing us as terrorists, are destroying the national security of our country. So they are working as a government media armies. So how can we can say we can activate the media unions and the syndicates to have a power, to have to work united to defend the independent media?
My name is N. Ravi. I'm publisher of the Hindu newspaper from India. There's an interesting question of who will man the ramparts of free speech along with the journalists. One obvious ally is, of course, the public, which has been discussed. That's a function of both the trust in the media and also the extent to which they read or view the mainstream media. But apart from these two, the public, there could also be 2 other forces, and one is where countries with the independent judiciary. The judiciary could be a useful ally for defense of free speech, which we have found it repeatedly in India, because very often threats to free speech come from the governments abusing laws rather than the laws themselves, in which case the judiciary comes to the rescue of the journalists. And another force could be publicity. When an isolated attack in a remote corner gets to national attention, or even if it is brought to international attention, that could be a very effective means of combating threats. I would like Mr. Jha and others to respond to this.
We got to be quick, Raj.
Yeah, sure. In fact, in India, the U.S. has the First Amendment. We don't have a constitutional guarantee to a free media. We have the freedom of speech, which is Article 19, and in fact, it is the Supreme Court that has, in case after case, redefined freedom of speech for us and has expanded the space for the media. So you're very right. An independent judiciary is fundamental to what we do. Now, will it be independent? How independent it will be and how independent it should be, that is something that we are debating, and we have huge stakes in that. And yes, the moment you shout from the rooftops that a reporter in a small town has been hit or has been assaulted, that is our duty to do that story. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Just to answer the Egyptian colleague, you were talking about the colleagues behind bars. I was reporting about women in Saudi Arabia last year and in 2017, and the ladies I've spoken to, they're also behind bars, and the allegations of especially women activists are contact with international journalists. This is a crime in Saudi Arabia. So what to do? I mean, we can't do much. We just continue reporting on that, even if reporting on the actual situation may have the consequence that they will not allow me back into that country. But this is the only thing we European journalists can do, and the rest must come from politicians, actually.
Just a quick point about who our other allies can be or should be. Yes, of course, if there is a strong and independent judiciary, it can be immensely helpful. If there is international support by international organizations like IPI and others, are nothing like it. For instance, if IPI, CPJ, RSF, they had not spoken for my colleague Cyril Almeida, he would have still been banned from traveling outside the country. So it does help. The problem at the moment is that we do not know, or at least the face of the enemy is not clear at the moment. They are working from behind, using social media tools by weaponizing the media to attack independent journalists and media houses. So what can the judiciary do about it? What can IPI do about it if the entire atmosphere is being created in the country where independent journalism is being maligned by a vicious campaign? So even if I was to approach the Supreme Court of Pakistan, what are they going to do about it? If I was to approach the international organizations, they can issue a statement to condemn, but beyond that, nothing is going to happen because the tactics and strategy of war against independent journalism has changed, and it is hurting.
I wish we could continue. I know Maria's got a point, and I'm going to pull it out of her afterwards, but if these journalists don't wrap up this panel right now, we will be under a death threat from the organizers of this conference. I want to thank Zaffar Abbas, Uta Brucker, Maria Ressa, David Jordan, Raj Kamal Shah. This is your first panel session. There will be more tomorrow. And just before we leave the stage, we've got two quick speakers coming up, including Barbara Triumphi, who you heard from earlier, and Jesper Højberg, I believe is the pronunciation, Executive Director, International Media Support. They're going to be speaking for about 10 minutes before we adjourn. So everybody hang in here for another 10 minutes before we hit the bar and the restaurant.